Hi, everybody. So this week I want to take some time to really delve into three of the concepts that are core to this week's chapter, which is about framing the immigration story. These are really important concepts for you to understand because we will be coming back to them again and again as we move through the course. And they're pretty easy concepts to grasp, but they do tend to overlap a bit, and I want you to understand clearly what they are not, and how they interact with one another. So let's dive in. So let's see, gotta advance my slide. So here we go. So our three concepts this week are agenda setting, priming, and framing. Now, in the readings, they use the immigration story in America as the example. I'm not going to in this video because I want to give you a more straightforward understanding of the concepts before we apply it to the immigration story. So let's start off with agenda setting. So if you have watched Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, you already understand at a pretty fundamental level what agenda setting is. Now, what is important, what I want to really drill into your brains when it comes to agenda setting is that the media does not have the power to tell you how to think, right? The media cannot jump into your brain and say, your community is very dangerous and you should be afraid of violence, right? They cannot do that. What they can do is cover story after story after story about examples of violence, which cumulatively, collectively, can create the impression that you live in a violent neighborhood, right? So agenda setting is an actual theory of communications that argues that the issues that the media covers will determine what it is that you think about, what you think is important, and it legitimizes certain stories, while it has a power to also marginalize or delegitimize other stories or aspects of stories. So let's take a look at the actual theory itself. So there's the reality, what is happening, right? Within a newsroom, journalists have the option to either share that reality with their audience or not, right? They could cover the story or they could not. And if they decide, and there are implications one way or the other. And then the way in which they go about telling the story, that's the media agenda. Once the media agenda is set, that then shapes the public perception of the world that they live in, which has an impact on a person's reality. So let's use a hypothetical example to talk about this. And I'm going to come back to the same example for each of these three concepts. So in this made-up situation, a person walked into a Fresno liquor store with a gun and held up the liquor store at gunpoint, took all the money out of the cash register, and sped off in their car. The person behind the counter called the police. Police show up. They say, is there any surveillance video? The person behind the counter says, absolutely. So they take a look at the surveillance video. They're able to get a very clear picture of the person who held up the store. And as they left the camera outside, from that, they were able to get that person's license plate. So from that information, they were able to find out where that person lives. They went to their house. They found that individual sitting on their couch, counting their money that they had just stolen, and they arrest that person on the spot, right? So that's the reality of what happened. Liquor store held up at gunpoint, suspect arrested within an hour or two. Now let's shift to a newsroom, let's say a TV newsroom. First question is, do you cover the story? Do we cover the story, right? So one newsroom might say, not that big of a deal. I mean, yeah, could have been a bad situation, but cops acted fast and no real consequences. We're going to pass. There are more important things happening in the city today. Another newsroom might say, whoa, this is a big deal, right? We want to cover this story definitely. And not just their decision to cover it, but again, how they cover it. Do they put it at the top of the newscast? Do they put it in the middle? Do they assign a reporter to it and do a really long package and interview the person who was held up and talk to neighbors? Or do they just mention that it happened and move on to the next story? All of those things are examples of media agenda setting, okay? Now, those decisions by the newsroom shape public perception. If you're watching a station that didn't cover the story, then you're not going to have any reason to believe that there was any violent crime in your neighborhood because they didn't cover any crime, and so you just go about your day and feel great. If they do cover the story, maybe you think twice before going to your neighborhood liquor store, right? Maybe you decide to order that 6-pack of beer online or, through some delivery app because you're nervous about going to the liquor store. And in that decision, your perception of reality becomes reality. Okay? So I'm going to give you another example of this. Actually, I'm not. We're going to move on to priming. So priming is a related but different concept. So priming is really the context that the media provides that sets the stage for how the audience is going to understand what happened, right? So getting back to agenda setting, it also involves the amount of time and space that the media devote to that issue. Is it on the front page of the paper or is it buried in the back? Those are signals to the audience that something is either very important or maybe not so important after all, right? And these things shape audience perception. So I want to point out this is similar to agenda setting, but it's slightly different, right? So in the example of the liquor store, priming might be a newsroom's decision to set up the story by talking about crime rates in Fresno, right? They might start out by saying violent crime in Fresno is up compared to last year. For example, just today, blah, blah, blah happened at this liquor store, right? So they are priming the audience to be concerned about their safety, right? Another way that a station might prime that story would be to say, while violent crime in Fresno is up compared to last year, law enforcement agencies say that it's actually at nearly historic lows, which makes the following story all the more surprising, right? So that's going to prime the audience to think, okay, something bad happened, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm probably not in any danger. So that's an example of sort of priming. Another example of that is, this is a graph that takes a look at news reports leading up to the 2016 presidential election by CBS and NBC's evening newscast. So you can see that the negative reporting on the issues of immigration, Muslims, health policy, and the economy far outweighed the positive news reports, right? So a couple things are happening here. First of all, the decision of the newsrooms to cover those topics shaped what people were talking about, right? Which is an example of agenda setting. And then the way that they talked about it, that negative focus, was really priming the audience to feel as if these are issues of concern. And then, of course, we saw that play out on the campaign trail with both candidates really talking about these issues quite a bit as part of their presidential campaigns. So framing is our third concept, and it's a little bit different. So media provide an environment and a focus that shapes our understanding of the events. And they do this in several different ways. They do this by the words that they use, the kind of spin that they put on a story, the storytelling devices that they use. Any kind of narrative element can help contribute to how a story is framed. So let's go back to our liquor store example. So there's a number of ways in which you could frame the story. You could frame it from the public safety perspective, right? So I don't know. Are you at risk? Are you at risk the next time you go to a liquor store? Today in blah blah this part of town, this liquor store owner nearly lost his life with an encounter with a robbery attempt, right, or a successful robbery. You can frame it that way, or you could frame it as, you know, the media or the law enforcement is doing a great job, right? You could frame it as there was, or thanks to the fast actions of Fresno police, a suspect in a liquor store robbery is behind bars and the streets of Fresno are safer, right? That's another way that you could frame the story that are going to have different, and the results of which is the audience is going to feel differently about the story that they're going to see. Same story, just framed in slightly different ways. So I'm going to give one more example of framing before we wrap up. So these are the covers of Newsweek magazine, two different editions of Newsweek magazine in the 1980s. And it's an old example, but I think it's a relevant one because it's pretty straightforward. So in this first one here, Murder in the Air, the story behind this was that the Soviet Union, but this back before the Soviet Union fell and it became Russia, the Soviet Union shot down a civilian airliner that had accidentally flown into their airspace. Now, the Soviets thought that they were shooting down a Russian or an American jet pilot, plane, fighter. But they weren't. It was a plane full of civilians, right? So when Newsweek covered the magazine, they framed it as murder in the air. Several years later, the United States shot down an Iranian, I think it was from Iran, an Iranian commercial plane, very similar circumstances. They were mistaking it for a hostile, jet fighter, somebody coming to get them, right? So almost the exact same scenario, but when Newsweek covered it, they framed it as why it happened, right? So, oops, we made a mistake, right? When the Soviet Union did it, it's murder in the air. When the United States did it, it's, here's why it happened, right? So those are very clear examples of how framing stories shape our understanding and experience of an event that occurred. So I hope that's helpful as you go about the readings this week. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out. Again, these are important concepts and we'll be coming back to them again and again. So really consider this an introduction. We'll be diving far more deeper into all three of these concepts. Thanks so much.